Nowadays, for very good reason, I rarely talk about anything except the climate challenge, the climate crisis, the climate emergency, or as I prefer to talk about it, climate justice. More and more, we're aware of this emergency. It's happening all over the world with impacts, but we're not still sure how to understand it, how to communicate it, how to live with it. That's the problem. So let me begin by reflecting a little bit that when I established my foundation on climate justice in 2010, climate justice was a kind of taboo subject. There were a minority of NGOs who talked about the justice dimensions, the unfairness, but it wasn't really being talked about. Climate change wasn't about people. It was about glaciers and polar bears and things happening gradually and slowly. That was what was happening. But I had seen the impacts in African countries because of my work after my time as High Commissioner for Human Rights, when I had a small organization which was working in African countries on the rights that matter if you don't have them, rights to food and water and health and education. And I kept hearing people saying, things are so much worse now. And what was it? It was they couldn't understand what was happening. A number of women said to me, is God punishing us? And then one woman, who's in my book on climate justice, stories about climate justice, and has become a very good friend, she's based in Uganda, and her whole village was wiped out by a terrible storm. And she said, we thought God was punishing us, and then we realized it was the lives of rich people. The lives of rich people. So that was a kind of interesting way of understanding what was happening. And she wasn't saying it in an accusing way. She was saying it in a completely factual way. That's actually the fact of the matter. And so what we need to do is understand that climate change is actually more serious than we think. It's happening faster than scientists thought it was going to happen. But the good news is we are also beginning to see a huge change happening, which is very positive, and a huge change in the fact that clean energy is becoming competitive with fossil fuel. So it's appropriate that we salute the young people who have come out in their millions. Do you know that more than 7.6 million people came out on Friday the 20th of September and Friday the 27th of September? I was in New York for the 20th of September when Greta Thunberg and so many other young people came out to march. But it was happening all over the world. It was the biggest march, bigger than the protests about the Iraq War, which before that was the biggest march in the world. So we had the biggest march led by young people. And I want to pay particular tribute to that now 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. As it happens, I saw a photograph of her when she was 15 years old, sitting in front of the Swedish Parliament on her own with a handmade sign. Somebody took a photograph and somehow I saw it. And I thought, oh my goodness, what a wonderful young person. But I didn't think she was going to become the leader she has become. And I sat in the climate summit in New York when Greta spoke. And I must say, she moved me to tears. And I just want to quote a little bit of what she said, because we all need to hear what she said. She said, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet, I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you are doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? I was stunned by how a 16-year-old, a child, can tell the truth to power in such a powerful way, because the assembled representatives of governments actually were quite ashamed. They felt quite ashamed because they know in their hearts that she's right. So it's true that every day the news on climate change gets worse. Let me give you an example. On the 11th of May 2019, scientists at the Mauna Observatory in Hawaii, which has tracked atmospheric CO2 levels since the late 1950s, detected 415.26 parts per million. The last time Earth's atmosphere contained this much CO2 was more than 3 million years ago, and sea level rise was much higher. Now, I don't want to depress the young people here. I'm full of hope. I'm chair of the elders, and we bring hope. So bear with me, and I will come back to a message of hope. And the message of hope begins in 2015. And I was there because I had my job as the special envoy of the UN Secretary General on climate change. And I was watching what was happening in two big negotiations. The first big negotiation was in September 2015. 193 countries agreed what is called the 2030 Agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I want to test young people in the room, and not so young as well, the room. How many people are familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? Are a little bit familiar? Good, 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 not bad, okay. Anyway, that was agreed in September. And the reason why it was a good package, it talked about leaving no one behind and having solidarity for the poorest countries in getting energy, etc. The reason, I think, is because countries knew it was voluntary. So they could pick and choose. They could do as much as they felt like. So that was that. And then we moved on to December 2015, and we were more serious about a treaty that was going to be finalized, the Paris Climate Agreement. The treaty was already quite weak, and as we got towards finalizing it, it became weaker, except for one thing, which was the role of the small island states and the poorest countries and the indigenous peoples, who were determined that we had to have a goal of staying at 1.5 degrees in the text. And I remember the mantra in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. And we got the goal of staying well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial standards, and working for 1.5 degrees. And that was new. That was new because the scientists had never looked at it. So the Paris Climate Agreement had to ask the scientists, actually, what does this mean? What's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? And if we have to stay at 1.5 degrees, what do we need to do? So the scientists gave very clear advice in October last year, a very clear scientific report. And I'm just summarizing it, maybe simplifying slightly, but not really. And they pointed out the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And they said, in that time, bad things happen. The coral reefs will probably pretty well disappear. The Arctic ice will pretty well disappear. And the permafrost will melt and throw up not just carbon, but methane, which is much more dangerous than carbon. So the world's scientists said the whole world needs to stay at 1.5 degrees and fight very hard for anything above that, because anything above that is getting into danger territory, and 2 degrees is dangerous, and anything above that is really, really dangerous. So that's what the scientists said, and then we had another report in May of this year on biodiversity. I'm sure you remember that report that talked about the extinction of species, that we could extinguish 1 million species. And then we had another report very recently on land use and forestry, saying what we have to do. And then we had a report on forestry and sea level rise. And all of these scientific reports are warning us that we're in a time of crisis. And the interesting thing about Greta Thunberg and the young people is they're saying, don't listen to us, we're just children. But we're smart children and we know what's happening. Don't listen to us, listen to the science. And that's what we have to do. And what did the scientists say to us? They said, it's doable if you have the political will. And what we need to do is we need to reduce by 45% carbon emissions between now and 2030. They said at the time you have 12 years. Now we have 11 years and we're in mid-October. Carbon emissions went up last year. They're pretty well certain to go up this year. So we're not on track. So that's an important message. So what do we need to do? I believe that what is required is that people from all walks of life become involved at a personal level on this issue. And they take 3 steps. The first step is to make the issue of climate change, the climate crisis, personal in your own life. And how you know you've done that is you work out how to reduce your own emissions, because we all have emissions that are adding in a small way to the problem. You recycle more carefully, turn off the electricity as much as possible, energy efficiency, or you change your diet. In my case, I've become a pescatarian. I've given up meat. It's a small thing, but I have to say I did love lamb from the west of Ireland, and that's gone. The second thing is we must get angry and get active. Get angry and take action. Get angry with those with more responsibility who aren't doing what they should be doing. And that is governments at all levels, but also cities and towns, communities. We need to all work together to do more, and we need to support the many organizations that are fighting for conservation, fighting for energy for developing countries, engaged in advocacy about climate change generally. And the third step, and I actually believe this is the most important step, and this is where we have the hope side. The third step is we have to imagine this world that we want to be rushing towards, because we've got to be in a hurry. We don't have much time. We have less than 12 years now. We have 11 and something years. What is this world? It's going to be a much healthier world, because we won't have the fumes of fossil fuel that are polluting cities, choking cities, causing a lot of dissent, causing a lot of problems. It's got to be a much fairer world, because we will have had to implement the 2030 agenda, because it is no longer voluntary. Neither the 2030 agenda nor the Paris Climate Agreement are voluntary anymore. They are now imperative. Imperative because of the science. So we have to have this wonderful solidarity of the 2030 agenda as a way of ordering our world, a way of ordering that we will get energy to developing countries. We will have a much fairer world. We will leave no one behind, and we will prioritize the furthest behind first. And let me end with a story about hope, because I'm told I have 1 minute. I'll take a half a minute to tell the story. It's very important that we have hope, because hope brings energy to do something. I wrote a book on climate justice, which is 11 stories of hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. But I learned about hope from the then chair of the elders. I'm now chair, but Archbishop Tutu was the chair at the beginning when we were formed by Nelson Mandela in 2007. And we were together, Archbishop Tutu and myself, on a panel in New York at a social good conference, which is young people on their iPhones and their iPads, like some of you now, making a little buzz on social media. And When Archbishop Tutu is in front of young people, he loves them. And he expresses that love in a very open way, tells them how wonderful they are, and his arms go all over the place. And we were being moderated by an American journalist. And she said, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he looked at her in surprise, and he shook his head, and he said, "Oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And those words really struck me at the time, and they strike me every time I say them. We all have to be prisoners of hope. Hope means we may not have much in the glass, it may not be half full, but we know that we have to work at it. We know what we have to do. You know, the best way to cope with climate anxiety is to get active on climate change. Psychologists are proving that. So if you've got a climate anxiety, get more active on climate change, do more, and you will feel more involved, more enthused, more ready to do what is. So hope, prisoners of hope, hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. Thank you very much.